Picture, if you will, one of Hollywood's most compelling leading men, a man born into an acting dynasty so revered that the very name, Barrymore, suggested stage magic and sparkling success. This man, John Barrymore, was handsome enough to make women swoon just by turning his face a certain way, and talented enough to command thunderous applause on Broadway one week and seduce audiences in a silver screen swashbuckler the next. If you'd met him at the height of his powers, you might have been convinced that here was someone blessed by the theater gods themselves, set on a path to immortality. And you wouldn't exactly have been wrong except for one tragic twist. John Barrymore was also walking the darkest of roads, saddled with a lifetime of chaotic family drama, personal demons, and a relentless, all-consuming addiction that eventually swallowed him whole. John Sidney Blyth was born on Valentine's Day in 1882. We know him, of course, as John Barrymore, but originally he was part of a lineage that included the Drews, the Blyths, and the Barrymores, interconnected families who had spent generations mastering the stage and enchanting audiences across North America and Europe. Imagine discovering almost from birth that acting is your family's currency. Your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had all been in the game, weaving illusions for paying crowds. Naturally, you'd think that a child like John would find it easy to slip into those footlights. But John's childhood was more complicated than that. His parents, the lauded Morris Barrymore and Georgiana Drew, weren't exactly the stay-at-home, tuck-you-into-bed types. They spent much of their time on tour, performing nightly while their children were left behind, sometimes with relatives, sometimes with acquaintances, and more disturbingly, sometimes even with Morris's mistress. It's easy to see how these unsettled conditions wreaked havoc on young John's psyche. Bouncing from caretaker to caretaker, rarely seeing his own parents, he started getting into trouble at school. He was expelled from multiple institutions for various forms of mischief, from sneaking off to night houses, the polite euphemism of the time, to rumored underage drinking. The most chilling part about that underage drinking expulsion is that it foreshadowed the bigger demon that would shadow him for the rest of his life. He discovered alcohol early, relied on it for relief, and found that the bottle would rarely let him go. When he was only 11, John's mother died of tuberculosis. The tragedy was heartbreaking but also strangely abstract. How do you grieve for a mother you hardly knew? He'd spent so much of his childhood separated from her that she loomed more like a distant figure than a comforting presence. His father, always on the road, didn't step in to offer the guidance or love John so desperately needed. In the emotional chaos left behind, John made a decision that shaped every future chapter. If no one else was looking out for him, then he might as well look out for himself, and if that meant trouble, well, so be it. As a teenager, John's misadventures escalated from garden-variety school pranks to something far more scandalous. While living in his father's household, John began a secret affair with his father's new wife, Mamie Floyd. It was disturbing any way you slice it. He later confessed it left him with a deep sense of shame, an undercurrent of trauma that would sabotage many of his future relationships. Can you imagine carrying the knowledge that your first sexual experience took place with your father's wife? That guilt, that taboo, it never really left him. For a brief moment, he found comfort with one stable maternal figure in his life. Louisa Lane Drew, his maternal grandmother, a formidable stage veteran who tried to provide the guidance his parents never gave. But heartbreak visited him yet again. Louisa fell ill, and John, then still reeling from everything else, watched her decline. She passed away with him in the room. His brother Lionel later observed that from that day on, John never really felt safe. His grandmother had been a rock in his stormy life, and now she, too, was gone. Despite this swirl of personal calamity, John wasn't exactly eager to follow the family tradition of acting. He was artistically inclined, sure, but he leaned toward drawing and painting, and with enough discipline, he might have made a career as an illustrator. But while he was scraping together a living as a newspaper artist in New York, one event yanked him back into the Barrymore fold. Maurice, his father, approached him, offering a chance to appear in a play. Hesitantly, John agreed. It wasn't about paternal bonding or the romance of the stage for him. It was simply a job. But father and son found themselves growing closer. That is, until a horrifying incident shoved them right back into catastrophe. Maurice began suffering alarming mood swings and bursts of paranoia. One night, he hurled vile anti-Semitic insults at an audience from the stage, leaving John bewildered. Soon enough, doctors diagnosed him with advanced syphilis that had ravaged his mind. John, in a cruel twist of irony, had to take out a court order to have his father committed. Maurice never recovered. He died in an institution in Amityville, and John's fleeting moment of father-son connection turned into heartbreak. Family darkness haunted John, but so did love in the shape of Evelyn Nesbit, a famously beautiful young model. She was, unfortunately, a kept woman under the protection of a wealthy man. That didn't deter a smitten John from proposing. Even though Evelyn herself seemed charmed, her mother wasn't having it. She insisted Evelyn refuse him because the family needed the older man's financial security. Rebuffed, John tried to pour himself into his art and avoid the stage. He found a job as an illustrator, only to be fired for drinking too much. That was the final straw. Flat broke, and with nowhere else to turn, John caved in to the so-called family curse. He became a stage actor. He told himself it was temporary, purely a matter of needing money. Yet in a rare alignment of fate, it turned out John had a natural flair for performance, comedic timing, and an easy magnetism that drew the eye. Still, even an audience-pleasing Barrymore can't hold on to a job if he's stumbling in drunk or missing cues. Producers and directors found him unreliable. It got so bad that his sister Ethel, already a successful actress, conspired with a producer to fire him so he'd get his act together. The next day, they rehired him. He was so rattled by that near disaster that he tried to mend his ways for a while. But unpredictability ran in his veins, and so did a growing fascination with alcohol that left him stumbling off stage as often as on. In 1906, a bizarre coincidence thrust him into the pages of his own dramatic story. His father, in a delusional rant, had screamed something about San Francisco being destroyed by an earthquake and fire. Soon after, John found himself in San Francisco, drifting off to sleep in a friend's home, when an actual earthquake tore through the city. The devastation was real, but John, in typical Barrymore fashion, spun tall tales of his heroic escapades. He sold made-up narratives to newspapers desperate for stories, describing how he'd helped troops clear roads or how he'd bravely dashed into burning buildings. In reality, he'd fled the city as soon as he could, heading onward to more acting gigs. Some might call that unscrupulous, some might call it enterprising, but it was quintessentially Barrymore. Work in the theater was sporadic, but John's dashing looks began to catch the eye of women who found him irresistible, especially a certain type of woman, the ones who were already married or engaged to wealthy older men. He found himself repeatedly cast as the other man, sharing laughter and more with showgirls, chorus girls, or socialites who wanted an affair that promised excitement, if not financial security. That pattern continued until he encountered Catherine Corey Harris in 1909. She was a 17-year-old debutante, and her father disapproved of the 27-year-old John. Her mother and grandmother, however, were starstruck by him. With their help, John and Catherine married in 1910. Catherine's father considered him a poor match, but it happened all the same. Marriage didn't tame Barrymore's wandering ways or keep him from the road. In the first year, he was gone so often performing that they barely saw each other. She tried to join him on stage to share a passion for acting, hoping that might help. But John's real passions were performing and drinking, and Catherine soon discovered she was an afterthought. That mutual neglect eventually led her into her own affairs, including one with John's best friend, James Montgomery Flagg. John felt a twinge of jealousy, but couldn't tear himself away from his boozy nightlife. They limped through a few more attempts to revive the marriage, but it was doomed. Interestingly, though, the split was amicable in a bittersweet way. Catherine ended up divorcing him for desertion, while John busied himself with blossoming success on the silent screen. She remarried twice, but when she became gravely ill about a decade later, guess who stayed by her bedside until the very end? John Barrymore. Whatever their differences, that deep sympathy was never completely lost. With his personal life in tatters, John threw himself into theater more intensely. A friend, the playwright Edward Sheldon, recognized deeper talents. Most of Barrymore's roles so far had been comedic, but Sheldon sensed there was a dramatic actor in John waiting to be unleashed. War soon overshadowed everything, though. When the United States entered World War I, John tried to enlist, only to be turned down because of varicose veins. He ended up helping the war effort by embarking on an affair with Blanche Ulrichs, a wealthy woman whose husband was away serving in France. At first it seemed like a fling, but the bond grew. By the end of the war, Blanche told her returning husband the truth and demanded a divorce. The husband asked her to go 6 months without seeing Barrymore, hoping maybe her infatuation would die down. John promised he'd wait, distracting himself with an impressive line of starlets. But after 6 months, Blanche came back to him, convinced of her feelings. John was smitten too. They got serious. Maybe, he thought, this was it. Real love. During this same period, his acting reached new heights. He dazzled critics in roles like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, displaying an ability to shift between affability and grotesque transformation. He tackled dramatic stage work that proved he was more than a comedic lead. The critics raved. Broadway called him a revelation. Meanwhile, Blanche was pregnant with his child, and John found himself stepping into fatherhood with a mixture of excitement and dread. In 1921, they married. A month later, their daughter Diana was born. But fatherhood spooked John. He adored his child, but admitted he had no idea how to care for her. He promptly gave Blanche full guardianship, conceding that he wasn't ready or able to be a hands-on dad. Such a dynamic didn't bode well for the marriage itself. The newlyweds took a trip to Europe, hoping to rekindle the romance. Instead, Blanche had an affair overseas, and John, upon returning stateside, poured himself into acting again. While filming Sherlock Holmes, he met Mary Astor, a beautiful 17-year-old actress who promptly became his next romantic entanglement. At 40, John was old enough to be her father, but that didn't deter him. Rumor had it Mary's father literally dropped her off for acting lessons at John's hotel, knowing full well they were engaged in something far more than reading lines. Meanwhile, Blanche was off in Europe, presumably pondering her own infidelities. Finally, it all ended. John's second marriage collapsed, with Blanche staying across the Atlantic while John returned to New York. He resumed stage roles, culminating in a mesmerizing performance of Hamlet in London. Shortly afterward, in a new film assignment, he met Dolores Costello. John had wanted Mary Astor for the part, but the studio insisted on Dolores, a young actress from a distinguished family in show business. The moment he laid eyes on her, he was enthralled, calling her the right one this time. But given his track record, everyone around him was skeptical. Dolores's parents certainly weren't thrilled. Her father vehemently opposed the match while her mother found John charming. The rift between her parents grew so severe that it eventually ended in their divorce, ironically overshadowed by the new marriage between Dolores and John. Despite these messy preludes, John and Dolores went on to have two children, one named Dolores after her mother, and the other named John after his father. You almost want to shout at them to get more creative with names, but the Barrymores did love tradition. Despite multiple personal and professional ups and downs, John's career soared again as he transitioned from silent films to talkies without a hitch. While so many silent stars faded into obscurity, John's theatrical training allowed him to deliver resonant line readings, further cementing his star status. He earned the nickname The Great Profile, thanks to his striking looks. At Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, instead of pressing his hands into wet cement like other celebrities, Barrymore pressed his face, effectively immortalizing that famous profile. Yet none of this star-spangled success could obscure a harsh truth. His drinking was accelerating at a dangerous pace. The more roles he took, the more he reached for the bottle to unwind. By 1933, John's physical transformation was obvious. His once chiseled cheekbones had softened, and he'd gained enough weight that certain camera angles were less flattering. MGM, after signing him for a series of films, quietly dropped him at the end, citing budget issues in the Great Depression. Insiders whispered it was because he could no longer keep it together on set, forgetting lines and missing call times. Soon, fewer and fewer studios were willing to take the risk, no matter how luminous his screen presence could be when he was sober. John's downfall became more public by the mid-1930s. He would show up on set, often hungover or still drunk, slurring words and repeating the same lines over and over. An entire crew would wait for him to get it right, sometimes tolerating dozens of takes. RKO at one point gave him a short hiatus so he could pull himself together, only to be disappointed when he returned and still couldn't perform. They replaced him mid-production, a blow that sent him spiraling deeper into despair. No doubt he was haunted by memories of how he'd once had to institutionalize his father. Would his loved ones do the same to him? Under increasing stress, John's marriage to Dolores cracked. He took off to London and India, trying to flee from his troubles, but found no peace. Eventually, he returned to the States only to bypass home and head straight to a hospital in New York for a bout of bronchitis. That's when a new figure stepped in, Elaine Barry, a fan who began visiting him in the hospital. Once out, John bunked at Elaine's place with her mother. Yes, while still legally married to Dolores, the tabloids, always hungry for a salacious Hollywood story, pounced. They labeled the new couple with references to Shakespeare's Tempest as a nod to John's theatrical background and feasted on the messy details of this growing love triangle. Dolores filed for divorce. John squabbled with Elaine and fled back to Dolores. Then he changed his mind again. The entire fiasco played out under the glare of the press. It seemed every move he made was another headline, and each headline chipped away at his dignity. Producers still recognized that John's Shakespearean gravitas could bring prestige. MGM cast him as Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. Rather than risk him being drunk on set, they effectively forced him into a rehab-like situation beforehand, hoping that by the time cameras rolled, he'd be sober enough to get through the part. But as soon as shooting began, old habits resurfaced. He grew unpredictable, forgetting entire swaths of dialogue. The final performance carried glimpses of greatness, but also a lingering sadness that this once proud star couldn't hold it together. In the end, the cycle kept repeating. John's affair with Elaine turned into a legitimate relationship, quickly overshadowing the remnants of his marriage to Dolores. He waited for his third divorce to finalize and then married Elaine, making her his fourth wife. By then, his finances were in ruins. Rehabs, health crises, canceled contracts, these all cost money, and John Barrymore had spent years living well above his means. Bankrupt and exhausted, he tried to claw back to solvency by accepting smaller roles, comedic self-parodies, or cameo appearances that, in a cruel twist, often had him playing a washed-up alcoholic actor. It stung because it was perilously close to the truth. With every new comedic cameo, though, there was an undercurrent of tragedy. People began wincing rather than smiling. The great profile was now an older, heavier man, often stumbling, red-eyed, voice shaky. By the early 1940s, he was a public spectacle. The press followed every meltdown, every hospital stay, every humiliating anecdote, including the blowout arguments with Elaine that often found their way into gossip columns. Eventually, she too filed for divorce a mere 2 months after the wedding. John, trying to pick up the pieces, took on radio gigs performing Shakespeare. Sometimes he'd show up in good form. Often, he'd be in a haze, saved only by producers who quickly cut away to commercials. Amid this chaos, he had one oddly bright experience, reuniting with his now-grown daughter Diana from his second marriage. She was forging her own path, capitalizing on the Barrymore name. Father and daughter spent some time under the same roof, but the old patterns of John's life intruded even into that. One evening, while he was bedridden and ill, he coaxed Diana into calling one of his girlfriends to come over. When the girlfriend arrived, Diana left in a swirl of anger and disillusionment, never to truly return. She later spoke with regret about that final exit, wishing she'd stayed and tried to understand her father's pain. But the moment was gone. Soon enough, John collapsed again, this time while rehearsing lines. He was rushed to the hospital, and after 10 grim days, he died of kidney failure and cirrhosis of the liver on May the 29th, 1942. He was only 60 years old. In the final analysis, John Barrymore's entire existence burned with a fierce, tragic brilliance. You can spot glimpses of that brilliance in old film clips, those black and white frames that capture the rakish tilt of his eyebrow or the commanding baritone of his voice. You can see it in the heartfelt tributes from co-stars who marveled at how, on a good day, his presence eclipsed every flaw. You can even sense it in the stories of his comedic quips, his ability to laugh at himself and highlight the absurdities of his own downfall. That comedic glint in his eye was sometimes the only shield he had left. If there's a lesson to glean, maybe it's that raw talent and a storied name can't save a person who's grappling with profound pain and unchecked addiction. Hollywood can shine an unrelenting light, exposing every misstep. Or maybe it's that certain legacies are too heavy for any mortal to bear. John Barrymore tried to outrun his father's ghost and ended up trapped in a ghost story of his own. Regardless, the life he lived and lost remains one of the most compelling tragedies the film world has ever seen. It was said that no on-screen tale of woe could compare to the real-life story of John Barrymore, the great actor and tragic soul who left us far too soon, forever haunted by the darkness from which he never fully escaped. His name still resonates through Hollywood lore, a cautionary echo that reminds us stardom can be a fleeting glimmer in a world that devours those who can't break free from their darkest shadows.